Hello, welcome to Take Two, the show that takes a second look at current events. I'm Fran Anderson. In this programme, we start with some news stories you might have missed. We get a report from Roy Hunter and Ian Henshaw on the background to the NATO coup in Ukraine and the crisis it has unleashed. First, here are the news shorts. Corruption rife in the EU. It's widely recognised during the Ukraine crisis that many in West Ukraine would like to join the EU. The argument seems to be that Russia is corrupt and repressive, while the EU is not. But are they right? Many of us here in the EU feel it is heading in just this direction too. You may have seen that recently EU counter-terrorism coordinator Giles de Kerchove told MEPs he wants to remove, quotes, undesirable websites. Undesirable, says who? You do not have to be a human rights lawyer to see the totalitarian implications of this intention. The corruption situation in the EU is hardly exemplary either. It's not only UKIP, the anti-EU party in the UK, which says this. EU Home Affairs Commissioner Cecilia Malmstrom has presented a full report on the problem and describes it as, quote, breathtaking, costing the EU economy over €120 billion annually. In fact, she says it's probably much higher than that. And this probably isn't counting the more sophisticated forms of corruption, companies bribing politicians in return for tax breaks, blackmail of well-intentioned politicians who might try to do something about it, defence contracts given by civil servants to companies that later put them on the board, and so on. We all know the deposed president of Ukraine had a lavish palace. Has anyone seen round Prime Minister David Cameron's various residences and estates? And what about that self-made multimillionaire Tony Blair? He could probably afford to buy a few palaces in Ukraine. One bit of good news, if the West Ukrainians are buying a turkey, at least the public in the EU knows about it. 3/4 of Europeans surveyed for the Commission study said that corruption was widespread. More than half said the level had increased. Even 64% of Brits believe corruption is widespread in the UK. New York campaigners seek a new investigation of 9/11. The New York City Coalition for Accountability now has announced the launch of the High-Rise Safety Initiative, a new ballot initiative that will require the New York City Department of Buildings to investigate all high-rise building collapses occurring in New York City on or after September 11, 2001, except the collapse of World Trade Center 1 and 2. The initiative will apply to the collapse of World Trade Center 7 on September 11, 2001, as well as any high-rise collapse that occurs in the future. The City of New York blocked NYCCAN's 2009 ballot initiative from going before the voters and becoming law. 5 years later, they have come back with a new ballot initiative that they feel is legally bulletproof. The official line is that World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed symmetrically and at freefall speed as a result of office fires. Meanwhile, here in the UK, we have news of a 9/11 debate at the end of March. It's planned for the University of Kent at Canterbury, and the motion is 9/11 was an inside job. Those who think 9/11 was not an inside job are normally reluctant to meet their opponents on equal terms. Back in 2005, the US Embassy flatly refused to send anyone to debate 9/11 at the Oxford Union, perhaps the most famous debating society of all. So some fear the new debate will somehow be cancelled at the last moment. 9/11 truthers have a warm spot for the University of Kent. 2 sociologists there recently published an unwelcome finding. Most internet posts they surveyed on 9/11 supported the inside job thesis, and supporters of the official story were more abusive and less rational than their opponents. We'll let you have more details as they are confirmed. Silver could make antibiotics more effective. Regular viewers will know that we always try to find some good news. This week it's about silver, But this is not a financial or jewellery story. Silver was used for centuries to fight infection, and as the agricultural use of antibiotics leads to ever more antibiotic-resistant bugs, it could be making a comeback. Hippocrates, the revered ancient Greek and father of rational medicine, was a keen advocate of silver. By the way, in researching this report, we discovered that Hippocrates, his famous dictum, "First do no harm," is not, as many think, part of the Hippocratic Oath, but it's taken from his wider writings. Recent experiments on mice indicate that, as well as offering wise advice for doctors, which should also be heeded by politicians and many others, Hippocrates was right about silver too. By the way, Take Two acknowledges the concerns of animal rights campaigners. There are usually better ways to research human conditions than harming animals, but having been done, this experiment is hard to ignore. In a series of experiments, James Collins, a professor of microbiology, and colleagues from Boston and Harvard universities have found that by adding trace amounts of silver to common antibiotics, the medications become up to 1,000 times more effective in fighting infections in mice, and even antibiotic-resistant bacteria were destroyed. In one experiment, 90% of mice treated with silver and a common antibiotic survived. 50% that just got silver died, along with 90% of the mice treated with antibiotics. As we make this programme, the Ukraine crisis is dominating the headlines. It's by now a familiar scenario. The most powerful military state on the planet, the USA, a serial breaker of international law, is involved in a situation in Ukraine, right on Russia's doorstep, and now argues that Russia is in breach of international law. I have with me Ian Henshaw and Roy Hunter. And Roy, let's turn to you first. You've been looking at the background in Ukraine.
Yes, so I've been looking at the history. So Ukraine has been in Russia's sphere of influence for centuries now, but it's only really since the Soviet era that it's been more or less directly controlled by Russia, and that was not by any means always by consent. Ukraine was divided and pushed and shoved, integrated here, assimilated there, all through the 18th and 19th centuries by the Austro-Hungarians, the Russians and the Polish. But it was in 1921, 4 years after the Russian Revolution, that the Red Army went in and annexed the eastern two-thirds of the country and the Crimea Peninsula. The westernmost third was annexed by Poland, and we have to remember that this is the country of the Cossacks, famed for their warrior culture and their fierce independence. It was only really after 1945 that West and East Ukraine were united within the Soviet Union. These are more or less the lines on which the country is split today. The assimilation processes were obviously very successful, as it's those in the east who were annexed by Russia in 1921 who support Russia today, and those in the west who were annexed by Poland who favour closer ties with the European Union. And annexation and assimilation are a couple of those words used by politicians to hide a multitude of sins. Annexation by Russia in particular was quite a bloody affair, while assimilation involved one of Stalin's artificially created famines, which is estimated to have killed between 7 and 10 million Ukrainians. Ethnic Russians were then moved in to fill the void left by those in the Holocaust. Similarly, after the Second World War, Russia forcibly relocated 200,000 troublesome Tatars from the Crimean Peninsula to Siberia. One of the problems Russia now faces is that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, these 200,000 Tatars have returned to their homes in the Crimea. The Crimea is predominantly pro-Russian, but this large minority of returning Tatars don't actually share that sentiment.
So it seems like this Ukraine, it could be very difficult for it to be a coherent country. Is that correct, Roy, Ian?
I mean, there's a sort of open understanding amongst governments that they don't like secession. No. You know, we've had this EU warning, threatening Scotland that if they secede, they might not be able to join the EU, which is a totally bizarre and dodgy statement because they're already in the EU. You know, are they really going to expel them just because they're independent of England? And then you've got Spain with their worries. You've got Russia, of course, with its worries. So, you know, the obvious solution which they did do after the Second World War to establish various borders after the Second World War. The democratic solution is you just have a vote. You take each province of Ukraine and you say, well, you're going to have a vote to decide which way you want to go.
Well,
that would be doable,
Sure.
but they don't want to do that.
No.
They're talking about the unity of Ukraine.
Sure.
So it could be that, as with Yugoslavia, that it does end up in a horrible civil war.
Well, that's the thing we need to avoid, really, isn't it? And that balkanisation, that partitioning of states, is something that seems to be one of the the NATO tools, really, for controlling countries.
No, I actually disagree. I think that that would be the solution, but they won't do it. But I was interested in the media side of this. The way they're handling it. I think there's quite a lot to be said for the theory that this is all just a bit of Western media hysteria. They're trying to bounce Russia into getting what they want by hysterical headlines, threats, of war. And the Russian, several of the things they originally said had turned out to be wrong. The Russians apparently have the right to station troops there under the treaty. And I noticed I happened to be looking at the BBC website, and it said UN envoys, attack Russia. So I thought, that's interesting. Had a look at it. Not true. What the BBC should have said was NATO UN envoys attack Russia. And one of the interesting things about this so far, as we go to, as we're filming now at least, is that the silence from the rest of the world, China, India, Brazil. No, I think NATO is isolated, and you can tell when they're isolated because when they start talking about the West. And when they're not isolated, they talk about the world community.
Okay, but do you think it's NATO that's isolated? I don't think it's NATO that's isolated. I think it's the US that's isolated, because Merkel's not particularly happy about this. We saw the photograph released, the photograph of the documents going into number 10. With the Bank of England, the City of London are going, let's not get involved in this because that's going to hurt our economy.
Never underestimate the British capacity for hypocrisy and
but
lies. They
I
can
think,
perfectly capable of starting a war with one hand.
But I think
the City
again,
of London
I think
with the
again,
other.
we see America here going, come on, let's go with our European allies, and the European allies are actually not that interested.
Only the Brits. I think
really.
The Brits are, but not.
Well, I don't even think the Brits are. Really.
Well, no, but they're interested in stoking up the hysteria.
So what do you two think about the uprising in Ukraine? Who exactly is involved in the uprising? Why? And do they have any foreign backers?
I'd like to give a little bit more background at the minute before we get into who's responsible, because I do believe that there is a popular will for in the west of the country. That west of the country, which was Poland before, and the east of the country was Russia. But I believe the west of that country, there's a popular will to actually join the EU. And what kicked this off in the first place was that Yanukovych was about to sign, they were ready and prepared to sign a deal with the EU. And then Yanukovych said, no, we're not going to sign that, we're going to sign a deal with Russia. And that's what a lot of the protests, that's what started a lot of the protests.
Because after all, let's remember the democratic issue here. The Ukrainian government that seems to have been overthrown, and I'd put a little bit of a question mark over whether this, I would call it a coup, is actually unravelling. But assuming it doesn't unravel, they've overthrown a democratically elected government. Nobody objected. 2 years ago, I think the elections were. Nobody, The Guardian, the Washington Post, nobody said that they had a big problem with those elections. There are new elections due in May. I think what I think really kicked it all off was when the new government said, and this was reported as per BBC reports in the first 24 hours, one, we're going to change the constitution. Well, that is not the way, when you've just grabbed power. Second, and even worse, they said that they apparently, I can hardly believe this, but the reports are that one of their first acts was to ban Russian as an official language. I mean, what sort of message? Can you blame Putin? I mean, if that's what they're doing in the first 48 hours, what are they going to be getting up to later? I just thought that was so obviously a partisan power grab, that any doubts...
Well, that was causing trouble, wasn't it? That was causing trouble. That's causing, as I say, the Western countries are in there hammering a wedge into this split. And that's what that was. That was a good whack on the hammer, hammering that wedge into the split.
Yeah,
the
quite
anti-Russian
likely, yeah.
thing. But when they did they took the constitution back to the 2004 constitution.
Well,
I'm not supporting anybody here, and you're quite right that it's a wrong thing to do. But it was there were 326 of a 450 cabinet that voted for that constitutional shift. I'm not saying it was right.
Yeah, but hang on. You see, this is the other point with this so-called revolution. I mean, the other side, the Russians are saying this guy was hounded out. I don't think. I mean, I noticed on the very first reports, I thought that Parliament's looking a bit empty for a Parliament, because they had shots of the Parliament and there was a lot of empty seats. And in fact, the Russians are saying, well, they hounded them out. These guys were threatened. And we could see on the TV screens there was a very violent, ugly people at work.
Yeah.
And these guys, they're MPs. They're not paramilitaries, and they were right in the middle. So the whole concept that Parliament.
You think they were threatened, do you?
Oh, for sure, beyond any doubt. And basically, you see, there's only three ways you can legally get rid of the president of Ukraine. One is if he resigns. Two is after a very complicated constitutional process which was not gone through, and three is if he's dead. Yeah. So basically Yanukovych was fleeing for his life. He didn't want to end up dead. He's not one of the world's big heroes. But that doesn't justify the claims that he's been deposed by the Parliament. He wasn't. He was deposed by a subgroup of the Parliament illegally. And how how journalists on the BBC and the Guardian and the Washington Post can blind themselves to that in their sort of hysterical allegations against Russia.
Well, I think the point is that those elections were coming up in May.
Yeah,
and that's what should have happened.
Yeah.
Everything, because there was unrest. It was recognised that people weren't happy with the government. And so, there's no political mandate to change anything, is there, really? So all of that contract signing with either the EU or Russia should have waited until after the election, shouldn't it?
And the coup.
And the coup, indeed, and the coup. And maybe it was that because this is definitely Western provoked. I'm not sure it's Western led, but it's Western provoked. And I think maybe because Yanukovych was going to not sign up to the EU and he was going to sign a customs union with Russia. And I think that's why the EU has come in now, or not the EU particularly, the Western powers have come in and stoked up this unrest to stop that customs union being signed with Russia.
Yeah.
But also Russia should have been waiting. Russia should have been waiting till after the election before that was signed.
No, hang on though, because if they'd done it after the election, they'd have said, well, you never told us about this at the election.
No, the people knew about it. And that's what a lot of the unrest was about. So everybody should have waited, because these new elections, which have been called early, have been called early because of the
under
unrest,
pressure from the protesters.
From the protesters. From the people. The protests and the trouble has been stoked up afterwards. There were genuine protests there. Russia and the EU should have waited until after the elections, because then they would have had a democratic mandate. There's been no democratic mandate there now. There's no democratic mandate for the protests and the trouble that's been caused and what we're calling a coup, which has occurred. If everything had waited till after those elections, then there would have been a democratic mandate to do something.
So, Roy, what would be the implications if Ukraine did join the EU?
Well, there's the thing. It would kind of be irreversible, because with the EU, you're all tied up with the IMF and the whole neoliberal austerity measures and all this. And the thing is with Ukraine, which a lot of people don't understand, is that they've already had 2 IMF loans. So in that way, they've already drifted westwards away from Russia a little bit. And to a certain extent, they've defaulted on both those loans. They defaulted on the 2002 loan, 2008 loan, beg your pardon. They had a 2010 loan as well, but the EU kind of didn't give them all that, because the IMF didn't give them all that. The other thing we've got to understand is that if Ukraine was to go with the Europeans, then they also become a member of NATO. That's what's happened with all the other ex-Eastern European states. And we've got to remember that NATO, its whole raison d'etre is anti-Russian. You know, NATO was formed as a bulwark against Russian aggression. So you can see Russia's seeing all these satellite states drop one by one, becoming members of NATO, potentially missiles on their borders. So I think that's the...
So Ian, what do you think Russia would feel about Ukraine joining the EU? What kind of implications would that have for Russia?
Well, I think Roy's absolutely right. You know, they'd be very worried that they were soon going to be with NATO, and that would mean missiles pointing at them. Obviously, they'd be somehow have to close their base in Crimea, which is very strategically important to them. If that base wasn't there, most people reckon that we'd be bombing Syria now. So that's one concern. One thing I haven't had a chance to look into, I don't know if you remember, but when Bush's most aggressive period after 9/11, they issued this new doctrine that America wasn't prepared to tolerate even regional powers independent of them. And so that, in a sense, if you're from the Russian point of view, with the missiles coming closer and closer, that looks a little bit like a declaration of war, a sort of, a semi-declaration of war. As far as I know, Obama has never reversed that. So as far as I know, the official American position, and certainly the position of the media in Washington and the huge sections of Washington, is that they're not tolerating Russia, but they're going to get around to them after Iran. Maybe in the debate is, are they going to go for Russia or China first? So I think the Russians are perfectly right to say that this is aggression in a sense, perhaps not tanks rolling in, but slow, semi-democratic sort of aggression.
So what do you think, you guys, peace activists around the world, how should they see this situation? I mean, should they be supporting Russia? Should they be supporting the Western powers? Where did it leave peace activists in this situation?
Well, I think Russia, nobody likes sending tanks in anywhere, and Russia hasn't done that. What's happened is the Parliament has passed a law saying they agree that troops can be used. Russia can put troops in there to protect their Russian-speaking ethnic Russian population, of which there's a large portion, of course, and they're in the eastern half of the country where the Crimea is. And at the moment, the Russians have only got troops in the Crimea, where they have military bases anyway. And the American Obama saying, that you can't do that. But you've got to remember that, and the foreign secretary, the Russian foreign minister brought this up, that when the US invaded Grenada, that was because they felt that 1,000 American citizens' lives were in danger in Grenada, and there's 10 million Russians there, so they've got their troops in there. They've got the situation stabilised, but there's no war going on. There's no tanks rolling in. And everything seems to be quietening down a little bit, I would have thought. I personally think it's the West again. It's the West throwing petrol on flames, which they love to do, don't they?
Would you agree with that, Ian?
Yeah, it makes money. It sounds awfully simple, but it really does seem to come down to money. Whether it's the profits that were made in Iraq, and then when you look at Ukraine, there's apparently a lot of gas there. And then you've got these neocons in Washington. I was reading that the Kagan family, there's one of them started the project for the New American Century, which basically planned out the invasion of Iraq before 9/11, very significantly before 9/11, not after. And then another one of them is a key policymaker in the State Department, whether it's under Bush or whether it's under Obama. And so it's, it's sort of mafia rule in America, is in a sense the theme here. Aggressively backed up, by the Wall Street Journal, the usual suspects, plus, the pro-EU lobby in England, it appears, like the Guardian newspaper, who are calling it a revolution. I don't think they would have called it a revolution if armed people in London had seized Parliament and shooed off all the MPs they didn't like and then forced to vote to remove David Cameron. I think they'd be pretty indignant about it. So, you know, once again, I mean, I think there's one conclusion everybody can agree on, is that we really do need an independent media.
Coming back to the Ukraine protesters, they're not a homogenous whole, are they? I mean, from what I've seen, correct me if I'm wrong, some of them are neo-fascists and they've been daubing SS slogans and things like that.
This is the West taking over again. You know, there were genuine protesters. You know, there was genuine protest. There were genuine grievances, and then the West has come in again, and the West seems to be, and we have proof of it, which I'll go into in a second. But you know, these neo-fascists are being fed by the Western intelligence agencies and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an oxymoron if you ever heard one.
Thank you very much, Ian Henshaw and Roy Hunter, and we'll be following this story on other episodes. Thank you very much for the People's Voice for airing us, and you can catch our shows on RADTV UK YouTube.